But certainly the last year has sped by since I came to Nelson at Dot's invitation to speak to the Chamber of Commerce. I was really thrilled when Dot then said to me after it, well, maybe we could do something about one of these poor villages that doesn't have any electricity. And I said, well, go for it. We'd always welcome some support. So that's what we're rallying around today, the business of hope. And sometimes hope can be in a bit short supply in countries that are under a lot of pressure. But every little bit counts, and what the project that Dot and the trustees are backing certainly will count. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But the country identified for the fundraising for the basic engine which brings electricity in a limited way to, or motor power to a village, is in Burkina Faso, and it's one of those countries in the Sahel about which I was speaking last night, which has multiple issues standing in the way of development. Many of these countries have a legacy of war and conflict and civil strife. They're particularly exposed to these extreme climatic events in a fragile region. Often have quite authoritarian governments, not particularly effective institutions, and all of this adds up to fragility, and fragility then, of course, coincides with extreme poverty. And I devoted a whole lecture on this to a big event for the Institute of International Affairs in Wellington on Monday of last week, talking about the impact of conflict and fragility on development. And when you look at countries' progress on achieving the Millennium Development Goals, which are pretty basic goals, the fragile states, and we're talking about a group of 20, 25 states, are the least likely to achieve the MDGs, and most will actually achieve none of them at all. They make up 77% of infant deaths in the world, and these aren't from the states with the mega populations. There's a lot of people in the Burkina Fasos, Afghanistan, Somalias, etc. We're not talking the populations of China, Indonesia, Brazil. We're talking about countries that aren't that populous, but the poverty is very concentrated in them. 60% of the world's undernourished people live in this category of states defined as fragile. And here's an interesting point, that as the very, very large developing countries move up the ladder of human development, and people are taken out of poverty, as they have been in China, 600 million plus taken out of poverty. India's slower, but it's going to get there. I think in the course of this decade, you'll see even more significant movement in India. So the projections are that by 2030, maybe something like 80% of the people who live in extreme poverty will be focused in these states with the sort of characteristics that I'm talking about. Ongoing war or conflict, low resilience to disasters, weak or no state, poor institutions, not very good governance, rapid urbanisation, because the countryside is splitting at the seams and very, very stressed, and increasingly a factor, large under-occupied youth populations, because there's a sort of tidal wave of young people coming through, all with hopes and aspirations which are very hard to fulfil in a lot of countries. And this big jobs crisis is one of the huge issues. So when we think of states that are currently in a meltdown, probably top of mind will be Egypt, top of mind will be Syria, getting a tremendous amount of international attention. But I thought to sort of describe the kind of state that we tend to be very preoccupied by, I would refer to the Central African Republic, which hardly anyone's ever heard of, because it is a landlocked, extremely poor country in Central Africa that's really never had a good run. It started life as an independent state as the Central African Empire, with a leader called Bokassa. And it was, of course, a very corrupt and unpleasant regime. But it's had, since he went, a series of coups, and the latest was in March. And in March, a militia sort of marched in from the north of the country and eventually took a number of the towns along the way. and it captured the capital. And there has been a complete breakdown of law and order and a state of anarchy in the Central African Republic. The health system, the clinics ceased to function. There's a very sad story about the many tens of thousands of people there living with HIV AIDS who lost access to their drugs. And if you lose access to your drugs, of course the drugs, then you can't just go back on them a month or two later because they've lost their effectiveness and the regime ceases to be effective. And the chances of someone coming in then with the next generation of drugs for this extremely poor country are not that great. So it becomes a death sentence. And in the towns and the capital city of this country, there is murder, there is rape, there is looting, awful home invasions. Child soldiers are being recruited. I mean, it doesn't really get much worse than that. And quite recently, the International Criminal Court prosecutor said that many of the crimes being committed were of these serious crimes of international concern standard, which the court would pick up. So it's a long way back from this. I spoke about Mali last night, which had its meltdown last year. Spillover from Libya, many armed men and arms coming back into the north of the country where there'd long been some sentiment for secession. So the secession groups took on the Mali army, which wasn't a huge task. It turned and fled reasonably quickly. But having fled from the north and abandoned it to these militias, who then fought among themselves, and the secessionists got pushed aside by a rather extreme Islamist group, the army then decided to get rid of the government in Bamako. And here was a country which had had a constitutional democracy for 20 years, but it was just poof, as though it was a puff of wind under all these pressures. And all this was happening at a time when the Sahel region was in the grip of an extreme drought as well. So we're involved in kind of helping Mali walk back from that, and it just had a reasonably successful presidential election, which I suppose is a good first step. But one of the dimensions of poverty is energy poverty, which Dot and the Trustees Project is about addressing. And energy poverty, well, there's about 1 billion people in the world who don't have as much as the electric light bulb. There's about a total of 2.5 billion who depend on traditional biomass for their heating and their cooking. Traditional biomass generally being the nearest vegetation. And in a very fragile and drought-prone region like the Sahel, it's very easy to strip out that vegetation. I actually haven't been to the Sahel in summer, in the green or wet season, if it rains. So I've never seen it green. My memory of driving in parts of Senegal and Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger is just of parched red earth and the odd tree. So that's easily stripped out, and of course the burden falls on the women to get the fuel and the water, so they're walking further and further and further. A lot of time consumed in this. And if you have no basic electricity or gas, well, of course you don't have lights at night, so any thought that your children might do homework or carry on their education is a bit idle chatter, really. And there's a huge domestic burden on the women because, again, all these domestic chores that we rely on flicking a light switch for, you have to do manually. And you know, this is fine if you're in a tramping hut for 3 or 4 days, but if it's your life, it's not much fun at all. So in these very poor countries where there is simply no energy infrastructure, it's pie in the sky to talk about a big energy project and a transmission grid marching out and the power supply coming to your village. It's not like the march of the New Zealand Electricity Department and the grid through New Zealand in the early 20th century. So you tend to look for local solutions, and what this project is fundraising for is a local solution. The engine, it's fueled by diesel, and yes, you can be critical and say the diesel's not a clean fuel. Actually, I've found poor people don't really care whether it's clean or not, they just want the energy. Now, over time, I hope we can do the clean solutions. You could presumably, with quite a bit of effort, you could grow fuel for a biodiesel, but we're not quite at that stage yet. In time, too, you could look for more solar solutions. But if you just go in and install a solar panel in a village and walk away, if someone doesn't know how to fix it, repair it, it'll be like many development projects which just don't ever get traction. And even with putting an engine for motor power in the village, someone's got to know how to maintain it, because otherwise, first breakdown, that breaks down as well, and the world is full of. But the whole thinking around rolling out these diesel engines as platforms for development in the villages is good and well integrated thinking that does combine the training, does then become a platform for villages to do other things, for the women to be able to process basic grains more quickly. Yes, the children can study at night. Actually, the women end up studying as well, because they've got more time and can learn to read. That's, a lot of things start to be loaded on to the basic platform of having some power in the village. And in Burkina Faso, the government has been so enthusiastic about this that it has a plan and a strategy to take it to scale across the villages of the country. And so through the partnerships with NGOs, civil society, development partners, the funding the government can afford itself, this is slowly happening across the country. Now, we don't hear much about Burkina Faso being in a state of conflict these days, but it again has a pretty difficult history. It started its independence life in 1960 as Upper Volta. The first military coup was in 1966, the second in 1980, the third in 1982, the fourth in 1983, and the fifth in 1987. And the captain who led the 1987 coup has now been in power for 26 years. So there's an issue of transition. I think he's younger than I am. He was quite young when he made the move in 1987. And with such countries, we plug away. We plug away on the energy environment issues. We plug away on the poverty eradication, plug away on gender, plug away on disaster risk reduction, and they've been quite receptive to that, and try to plug away on governance. But there are some elephants in the room on governance. So